Welcome back to the ISL Politics Podcast. I am your host, and today, sadly, I cannot be joined with my co-host Dante. However, we have a huge episode for you all today, and where we will cover some huge topics like the current U.S. impeachment trial, and of course, the result of the vote from that trial. And then we will move on to Brexit and the future of Europe, which has been dominating most of European news these past weeks. So, let's not waste any time. Today we're going to start off with news recap where we watch the BBC 1 Minute World News and discuss the topics presented. And I will give my own personal interpretations, and I'm very excited with how people will also interpret the 1 Minute World News. All right, so let's watch the video now.
This is BBC World News. I'm Lucy Hawkins. The headlines. The South Korean film Parasite has become the first non-English language movie ever to win Best Picture at the Oscars. South Korea's president said the film had moved people's hearts around the world. China has recorded its highest number of deaths in a single day from the coronavirus. Tight restrictions to contain the disease remain in place, which has killed more than 900 people so far. The leader of Germany's Christian Democrats, the main governing party, says she won't be putting herself forward to replace Angela Merkel as Chancellor. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer was once highly favoured to take over the role. And record rainfall along Australia's east coast has resulted in widespread flooding, but it's also helped to put out two major bushfires in the state of New South Wales. About 100,000 homes are without power.
So we have some great headlines to work with today. So, I'm going to pass through the Oscars. It is interesting culturally to talk about. It's very interesting that Parasite, of course, which is a movie from South Korea and whose language is actually in South Korean with English subtitles. And it's very interesting, and of course it sets a precedent that, a non-English and a non-American film won this year's Best Picture for the Oscars. Now, we've seen, how globalism has really managed to breach a lot of cultures, and how a lot of cultures that previously, the West didn't pay attention to are now being paid attention to. Of course, an example of this is how Korean pop music is, slowly becoming more popular in the West. And it's super interesting to see that, South Korea, especially currently, is really heading the headlines in this sort of integration and this sharing of culture that we are seeing, and that is becoming more easy and facilitated thanks to global trade and global economics, and of course global sharing of culture and ideas. Now, however, I want to really move on to the major political headlines. So the first headline presented by the BBC is of course the coronavirus, which is still currently ravaging China. And I really want to talk about, since we are a politics podcast, I really want to discuss the political impacts and, of course, the economic impacts that this can have, because, the virus has now surpassed, I think, the 2008 outbreak of SARS with the number of fatalities. And what is really concerning is that, of course, we are currently seeing around the world footage from inside China showing how major cities are being heavily impacted by this, virus outbreak. There are footage of Beijing being completely deserted, nobody on the streets, nobody's willing to use the metro because, crowded spaces can lead, to the spreading of this virus. And of course we've seen, how Wuhan is now being deserted, how Guangzhou, the mega city in the south, is currently also being impacted by the disease. And, while it is interesting to see the coronavirus from simply, a medical point of view, it's also more interesting to me personally to see it from a political and economic point of view. Now, from an economic point of view, the coronavirus is going to have a huge impact on the world economy. China is, arguably the main producer of goods in the world, and we are currently seeing its major industrial centers like Beijing, Guangzhou, Wuhan, and the province and the cities around the Pearl River Delta being completely shut off, almost entering in a state of hibernation, as nobody's willing to work and nobody's willing to use public transport because of fear of catching the disease. And already we are seeing, the effects of this with production in China dropping precipitously. And, in a few weeks' time, this could have major impacts on the world economy. Because with China no longer producing as much as it is producing now, we could see shortages of goods around the world. Now, of course, there can be this whole debate of, drawbacks of a global society, meaning, because we are seeing how one crucial part of the global chain breaking and how that affects everybody. The virus in China is not just merely a concern for China. The economic impacts that are happening in China are also affecting us here, for example, in Luxembourg, economically. So I think that is very interesting to consider, and I think it is maybe foolish to just see it from a medical point of view, because that really shuts us off to really the global impacts that this virus can have, and makes testament to the fact that even if you personally don't catch the disease or you don't know anybody that has the disease, it can still impact your life in a very big way because of the fact that we now live in such a globalized society. Now, in terms of politics, what is hugely interesting is maybe the long-term impacts this can have. The Chinese government has relied for years on the fact that the country is doing well economically to have a lot of public support. And we have already seen protests break out because the doctor that actually discovered the disease in China was told by the government to reduce his voice and his spreading of knowledge about the disease. And what is truly tragic is that the doctor actually died from the virus. The doctor that discovered the coronavirus has actually passed away after he contracted the disease. And we actually are seeing now people lay memorials all across China in honor of this doctor that gave his life away to sound the alarm. And it is also mixed with anger because the government in Beijing has ignored for so long the reports coming out of Wuhan that the disease was there and that it could potentially be very, very, volatile and prone to spreading rapidly. And, so we are seeing how a medical outbreak and a virus outbreak can have huge political consequences. I don't think China, after this outbreak, will be able to just shrug it off as an event, because people are going to have the coronavirus, especially Chinese citizens are going to have the coronavirus ingrained in their memory. And it could lead to, the general populace having a lot of grievances in how the government handled the situation. And so I think we need to consider that as well. Now, does that mean that I want China to be completely destabilized? Of course not. However, it raises concern about just how effective the Chinese government can respond to outbreaks, and a government that is built around controlling the production of information, controlling how information is shared, who shares it, and what's inside of it, what the information contains, and how that can actually worsen reactions to medical outbreaks or other forms of damages to a nation. And so it's very interesting to see if actually the coronavirus will create more political divisions in China because of how the government has handled the situation. Now, I want to move on to the next event mentioned by BBC World News, which is about German leadership. So, according to the BBC and according to many news outlets, so Angela Merkel, the current head, but soon to be former head of the Christian Democratic Union in Germany, currently the largest party in Germany and the one that has a ruling coalition. Angela Merkel is reaching her term limits, and therefore Angela Merkel has tried to transfer that leadership to another member of the party, and now that member is refusing to has also said that she would not assume the leadership. Now that it could be very concerning in Europe and at large, because of course Germany plays a vital role as the leader of the EU, and so it is deeply concerning heading into the next German elections, how this early lack of leadership might have deep impacts and negative consequences for the CDU as a whole. And of course, we are also seeing how the AfD is growing in popularity in Germany. Recently, in the state of Thüringen, the Liberals have actually made a coalition with the AfD to gain a majority, and it's raising many concerns in Europe and especially in Germany about the growth of the AfD and how with a lack of a lack of strong SDU leadership and a strong SDU party, how the AfD might benefit from that disunity within the biggest party currently in Germany, and how it might capitalize on that disunity to gain a lot of seats in the next election. And of course, there are a lot of divisions about if the AfD is a good party, if it is a bad party, and of course its messaging, its policies and ideas. However, what is apparent is that this disunity within Germany's largest conservative party could very well lead to the growth of the AfD. And so it is very interesting to see how the future German elections will go, since currently the CDU is being portrayed as quite disorganized, and how, and it also raises questions about how long politicians should serve as leaders of parties, because Angela Merkel has been in charge of her party and of Germany for multiple years, and how suddenly with this very vital figure gone and this visionary out of the picture, how that has really kind of stalled the CDU in really finding a new vision for itself and how it's gonna market itself during the next German parliamentary elections. So we have that clip as well. So now on to the last clip is, of course, record rainfall in Australia. It has not been a good 2020 for Australia currently. Of course, we have seen the bushfires being a huge issue in Australia. However, as the BBC reported, the record rainfall has actually allowed 2 large bushfires to be put out was it? I think it was South. No. Hold on.
About 100,000 homes are without power. Wales put out 2
Yeah,
major
New South.
bushfires.
Okay, yeah. So 2 large bushfires have actually been put out by the record rainfall in New South Wales. So I mean, it's very interesting to see how Australia went from this really hot season, which caused the bushfires, and how it quickly spiraled into a lot of precipitation, a lot of rainfall. And of course, this I think the bushfires and the record rainfall across here, and of course we're currently experiencing storms in Europe, and it's interesting to see how the green movement and the climate change movement is going to point to those examples as examples of why we need to act now on climate change. And of course it's a shame that Australia currently is suffering from such extreme weathers. However, it is interesting to see how the Australian public will react to these catastrophes, and if it will finally motivate them to take a lot and way more drastic actions to try to reduce the damages that climate change can cause on their natural environment. So I still hope that from these catastrophes, some good and some new policies that really tackle the issues that cause these catastrophes can finally be talked about, and solutions can finally be reached by the Australian government, and of course the Australian public. So I'm trying to see the positive in the negative here. So that was the 1 minute world news by the BBC, and so now let's move on to our segment News That Matters, where we look at political developments that we believe are especially important to people our age. And today I will be looking at Brexit and the future of Europe. As we all know, recently the EU Parliament ratified the departure deal of the UK, which means that now the UK has entered, of course, a 1-year transition period where it will attempt to renegotiate and negotiate its future relationship with the EU. And of course, this has raised many concerns. And of course, this is a huge moment because it finally means that the UK is heading towards a direction that clearly outlines that it is going to definitely leave the EU. And of course, that means huge shifts in the EU. Of course, on I think the 31st of January, or the 30th of January, if I'm not mistaken, when the UK withdrawal treaty was ratified, the UK lost all of its European Parliament seats. And it's interesting to see how, with all those seats gone, how Europe and the EU at large is going to change from this. Because the UK has historically been one of the most reluctant members in the EU, and it has been especially opposed to further European integration. And so this could be a huge opportunity for the EU, because it is now no longer dealing with this huge roadblock and this important nation that is opposed to further integration. I'm actually going to pull up a news article from the European Parliament, and the headline is the EU presidents lay out priorities for the future of Europe. So I'm going to just read the article, and I think it is very important because this here is the EU leadership outlining, how the EU is going to head into a new age without the UK by its side. So, President Sassoli, in his replies to journalists after the statement, said, "Ask yourselves this. Why does everyone want to divide us today? Because when there are common rules, we live better and defend those who are weaker. Where there are no rules, only the strongest prevail. Perhaps those who want to divide us are afraid of a world with rules. At this moment, I believe that the EU's importance lies in the answer that we are able to give to this question, not only for us, but for a global world that has to live by rules. Without rules, the strongest will prevail and the weakest will be excluded, and the EU does not want that." Following yesterday's meeting in France at the House of Jean Monnet to reflect on the future challenges facing the European Union, President Sassoli, Michel von der Leyen made statements today at the Parliamentarium Visitors Center in Brussels. And so we have a couple of statements. I won't read every statement by each of the presidents. However, here's the concluding line of the article. "The departure of the United Kingdom marks a new chapter in the history of the European Union. Today's statements aim to look ahead at the specific internal and external challenges that need to be addressed in the years ahead and how to involve citizens, civil society, and national parliaments more in the discussions and decision-making that will shape Europe's future." So I think this really kind of summarizes what I was talking about before in the introduction to News That Matters. The reason why I believe that this is really so important for people our age is, of course, most people in ISL that, of course, are listening to this podcast are, of course, EU citizens. They live in EU countries and are impacted by EU laws. And, as we get older, we will soon be the ones voting to send representatives to the EU Parliament. We will be the ones deciding on how we want Europe to evolve. And I think that since the UK is leaving, it is important to see, how that could bring about benefits and how it could bring about consequences. Because of course now with the UK leaving, it means the EU will lose one of its largest economies. This means that the EU as a trading bloc will be less powerful. However, on the other hand, the UK leaving, has removed this huge barrier and this huge opposition towards further integration. And, as stated by President Sassoli, I believe that the EU's importance lies in the answer that we are able to give to this question. And of course, the question is, ask yourselves this: why does everybody want to divide us today? And so I think of course the statements made by President Sassoli is of course directed towards other countries wishing to leave the EU and being disgruntled by EU decisions and institutions. Now, of course, personally, I am of course pro-EU. However, I have, over the past agreed with people who had issues with how the union is currently working. Of course, I do not approve when the EU passed, for example, laws that would hinder net neutrality, and of course I was opposed when it was, kind of overreaching its bounds. However, of course, I am pro-EU, and I know that that sentiment might not be universally shared, for example, in ISL, and of course Europe as a whole. However, I think even if, no matter if you're pro or anti-EU, it is important to consider how the UK's departure will lead to further European integration. And that's of course a possibility with this huge barrier to integration now being gone, and it will be definitely gone by the end of this year after the transition period. I think a lot of the EU's leaders will take advantage of that fact that the UK is no longer in the EU and that there is no longer such opposition to integration. Of course, currently the EU is discussing creating its own army, its own independent armed forces, and of course expanding, the powers it has over domestic and foreign affairs. Now, that is not necessarily a bad thing. A further integrated Europe and a stronger centralized Europe is not necessarily a bad thing unless done incorrectly. As the EU is likely to move towards further integration, we of course have to focus on making sure that democracy and that strong representative institutions are of course maintained and of course strengthened. That is the main thing we have to ensure if the EU continues to further integrate. We have to focus on making sure that the underlying values of most of Western Europe are kept. Values like democracy, liberalism, representative democracy, and of course, rights. And so it is important that we start, of course, thinking of how a future, stronger, more centralized Europe, we have to start thinking about how do we ensure that those rights and those liberties are preserved. Because, of course, a lot of people would argue that a stronger EU will lead to more repression, of course, a degradation of civil liberties. And I don't think that's necessarily true unless it is, of course, done badly. I don't want, my generation to charge into this new decade, believing that, hey, if we just add more institutions, add more regulations, add more and more and more to the EU, that it will always result in positive results. I think that is, incredibly dangerous to believe. I think that if change is to come to Europe, we have to do it in a stepwise process, incrementing change, really, really deeply considering every new proposal we put in front of the EU and every new major decision that's going to change the nature of the EU, if we want an actual, proper, free, and democratic EU. So that is at least my personal sentiments. And I want to just wrap up this segment with another news article from the European Parliament about the actual Brexit deal approval. So, in a debate with the Croatian State Secretary for European Affairs, Nikolina Brnjac, on behalf of the Presidency of the Council, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and the EU's chief negotiator Michel Barnier, Parliament took stock of the withdrawal process so far and the challenges ahead. Commenting on the historic importance of the vote, most speakers on behalf of the political groups highlighted that the UK's withdrawal will not be the end of the road for the EU-UK relationship, and that the ties that bind the peoples of Europe are strong and will remain in place. They also mentioned that there are lessons to be learned from Brexit that should shape the future of the EU, and thanked the UK and its MEPs for their contribution throughout the UK's membership. Many speakers warned that the negotiations on the future relationship between the EU and the UK are going to be difficult, especially taking into account the time frame provided in the withdrawal agreement. That is very interesting, because of course, I think there are some camps in the EU that are happy that the UK is leaving. Of course, as I've talked about, minutes before, the departure of the UK removes this huge barrier of integration. However, as highlighted by this news article, the UK's withdrawal will not be the end of EU-UK relationships. And I think it is important to think Brexit is not a shut and done deal. just because the treaty and the withdrawal agreement has been ratified now doesn't mean that Brexit is now over. There's now this 1 year of crucial negotiations that will take place that will determine so much of the future UK-EU relationship that we also have to ensure is done properly. And of course that can divide a lot of people. Some people say that of course the UK wants out, then we should properly ensure that they leave the EU fully. And that is of course many stances that many British citizens have, took, that they should fully leave the EU. Of course now there is the other camp that of course says that even though the UK is leaving, we should try to, keep it we should try to make sure that it stays within some key institutions and that it still tries to cooperate a lot with Europe. And I don't really have an answer to which path will lead better benefits. I feel like that is up to the voters that decide, the EU Parliament's composition, but it is also up to us to ensure that, of course, the UK doesn't feel alone. It is important to make sure that, whatever the future between the UK and the EU, that it doesn't lead to hostility and instability within the EU or the UK. So I guess that is my final statement to wrap this up. Just because the withdrawal agreement has been approved, and I'm just going to read out the vote because it was 621 votes in favor, 49 against, and of course 13 abstentions. So of course it is of course interesting to look at those 49 against. But, as I just said, just because the withdrawal treaty is of course ratified, doesn't mean that, the future between the UK and Europe is set in stone. So now let us move on to our final segment of the show, now on to Deep Dive. So today I'm very excited because we're going to talk about a really important, subject to me. We're going to talk about the impeachment trial of President Trump and what lessons we can learn from the events, interesting details about how the Senate voted and how this may impact the incoming U.S. presidential elections. So I want to immediately head out to the vote because most people know that, of course, that President Trump was going to have a trial in the Senate about his impeachment articles. And so from this Politico article, we can clearly see the vote distribution. So to impeach a president in the Senate, you have to get a 2/3 majority of the vote. So let's look at each vote because Trump was charged with two violations, two impeachable offenses. Article 1, which is the abuse of power, and Article 2, obstruction of Congress. So in the first vote, 48 senators voted guilty, 52 senators voted not guilty. In the second vote on Article 2, obstruction of Congress, 47 senators voted guilty, 53 senators voted not guilty. So this is hugely important because it showed party divisions within the U.S. Senate, of course, the U.S. as a whole. The vote itself was divided exactly amongst party lines. Now, of course, there was one huge exception to this, and there's, of course, one huge exception to this with Mitt Romney. Now, as I mentioned, the first vote was 48 guilty, and the second vote, it was 47 votes guilty. And so on Article 1, Mitt Romney actually decided to vote against the entirety of the Republican Party by voting yes, guilty on Article 1, abuse of power. Now, this is huge because it shows that even though the vote came across party lines, there was still this one important case of a senator, Senator Mitt Romney from Utah, deciding to split with the party and deciding to vote based on what he thought was the correct way to vote. And I think that is hugely encouraging. I think despite the failure of the Senate to vote, the 2/3 majority guilty to remove Trump from office, it is still, I think it's still positive to see that at least one senator decided to vote, based on the evidence he actually saw instead of voting based on what, the party leadership told him. and I think we should really we should really respect Mitt Romney. I know a lot of people have issues with Mitt Romney, but it was great to see at least one senator deciding to go and vote based on the evidence he knew instead of based on what his party told him. And so, however, of course, on the whole, this vote was extremely down to party lines. All the other Republican senators voted no on both accounts. All Democratic senators voted guilty on both charges. And so, it is hugely important of a decision. The Senate acquitting a president is not, an ignorable or minor action. It is a huge decision. And of course, I want to move on to this article by the New York Times, which talks about the impeachment trial itself. And so, okay, so I'm going to launch immediately into the article because I think it outlines a few details that is important to note. The Senate acquitted President Trump on Wednesday of charges that he abused his power and obstructed Congress, as Republicans turned back an election year attempt by House Democrats to remove him from office for pressuring a foreign power to incriminate his political rivals. The tally for conviction fell far below the 67 vote threshold necessary for removal, and neither article of impeachment garnered even a simple majority. The first article, abuse of power, was rejected 48 to 52, and the second, obstruction of Congress, was defeated 47 to 53. Senator Mitt Romney, Republican of Utah, was the only member to break with his party, voting to remove Mr. Trump from office. The votes ending the third presidential impeachment trial in American history were a resounding victory for Mr. Trump after 5 months of blaring scandal over Ukraine that embroiled Washington and threatened his presidency. But both sides agreed that the final judgment on Mr. Trump will be rendered by voters when they cast ballots in just 9 months. And so then of course the article moves about how Trump was advised to stay silent despite his acquittal. And so it is very interesting to see because the question I have here that I put on my script is how may this impact, how the acquittal can impact the incoming U.S. presidential elections. And I think it can impact the U.S. presidential elections in, huge ways. Nancy Pelosi in a speech after the vote said, despite him being acquitted, he is still impeached. The tag, the name of impeached will follow him forever. And it is interesting to see, how much impact this actually has on Americans, because despite Nancy Pelosi clearly thinking that this branding is, a big deal, it is important to see that how it will actually impact, people's voting. Are Republican voters that voted, Republican in 2016? How are voters that voted Republican in 2016? Going to be influenced to vote Democrat in the following elections? The question really is, are people more concerned about the accomplishments of Donald Trump or the failures of Donald Trump? Because, to many people, this doesn't really matter. To many people, they have voted Republicans for generations, and they will keep doing so. And for many people who voted for him in 2016, they will argue that the accomplishments he's done in the economy, which of course can be debated, are more important than the fact that he was temporarily marked as impeached. So, it is important to see if a president being marked as impeached really has an effect on the American voter, or if the American voter in general worries more about the the American economy, the American unity, and of course American foreign policy. And however, of course, we can definitely argue that the Democrats are going to use the fact that Donald Trump was charged with impeachment as a branding tool, and of course as an attack on him during the 2020 campaign. Now, because of course we've seen with many, currently all major Democratic candidates are arguing amongst each other about who has the best chance of defeating Donald Trump. A lot of, Democratic candidates currently have their campaigns centered on the fact that, oh, I am the best choice to defeat Donald Trump. Democrats really are centering their whole message going into the 2020 election, centered around the message that, hey, we are the party that can finally defeat Donald Trump. We aren't going to be the party in 2016 that is going to fail to defeat Mr. Trump in the presidential election. And of course, it remains to be seen if that will actually be the case. And what I think is really interesting is, of course, the whole idea of impeachment, because many people argue that impeachment is of course a necessary tool to be able, it is a necessary right to be able to remove a leader that has abused the Constitution in a democracy. That seems apparent. However, I'm gonna actually pull up this really interesting quote from President Gerald Ford, who was the president that acquitted Richard Nixon after he was impeached. And this quote is, I think, hugely important because, it highlights the point I was making about how impeachment in general really falls in with political lines. So when asked about impeachment, Gerald Ford replied like this: "An impeachable offense is whatever a majority of the House of Representatives considers it to be at any given moment in history." Now, to me, that is incredibly pragmatic of a stance to take. What he's basically saying is that impeachment is not really this grandiose idea that, hey, our leaders should be held accountable, but is more determined by how the political situation is in Congress. Would the Democrats even have first tried to impeach Donald Trump if they didn't have the required majority in the House of Representatives? One could argue very well that they wouldn't have if they didn't have that required majority. However, clearly, as we've seen, the vote came down to party lines in the Senate. And, that raises concerns, what the point of this whole impeachment was. Because it failed. It crashed and burned quite spectacularly in the Senate. Not even talking about a 2/3 majority, the Senate didn't even reach a majority on either articles of impeachment. And so it kind of validates what Gerald Ford says, that an impeachable offense is whatever the House of Representatives considers it to be at any given moment. And and it's kind of I'm out of words here, but it is the reason why the Democrats, I think, launched this whole impeachment trial is, despite the fact that they knew they weren't going to be able to fully impeach him, I think they believe that the fact that he has now been branded as an impeached president, that it's going to impact and influence how voters vote in the 2020 election. And it remains to be seen, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see if that strategy actually pays off. If voters in the United States actually care about the fact that Donald Trump was charged with impeachment, or if they more care about what he has actually achieved whilst in office. And, I think this decisions that we have seen in the Senate, is going to carry huge impacts about how American voters not only view the whole process of impeachment, but how they view the upcoming elections. All right, that is all the segments we have today for episode 4. Thank you very much for tuning into this week's episode of the ISL Politics Podcast. If you have any requests for any specific topics, please email either me or Dante, who sadly can be here today with us. And remember to like and subscribe, and of course comment, have discussions in the comments, because I really want people to discuss the topics presented in our episodes. And if you want to support us, or if you want to appear on this podcast to really promote and argue about a specific topic, feel free to email either me or Dante, as I said before. And, and I hope you have, from today's episode, really taken some really important political lessons. And I hope that this show has allowed political discussion to take place. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We will see you next time.